Welcome to the NNJR Trackside Classroom Series. Today is one of our series about braking. Specifically today, we're going to talk about advanced braking, and I'm going to share a number of tips that you can try. As always, the disclaimer is here that says we believe this is good advice, but you use it at your own risk since you're on track. But with that said, let's dive right in. So here's what we're going to cover today. A brief discussion about our priorities when we're on the track. And then we'll take the braking sequence apart and go through 6 ways that you could potentially work on improving your braking on track, and they're in roughly a sequence that you can think about applying them. So just before we dive in, a reminder about what the priorities are when we're on track. The first priority is always the line. If we don't have the line right, and if you remember as a beginning driver, that was the first thing you had to learn. Well, the line is still important. So if we're not getting the line right, if we're missing the apex or missing the turn-in or whatever, we need to fix that. Braking better isn't necessarily going to help with that problem at all. The second priority is what Skip Barber calls corner exit car control, which basically means getting on the gas as soon as we can, and most importantly, getting our foot on the floor as soon as we can, the so-called WOT, or wide open throttle. And then last and least in this case is braking. So if we have to have the first 2 figured out before we can optimize the braking. Now, when we get the machine to wake up here, when we think about entering a corner, let's take that apart a little bit. First step is obviously to take our foot off the gas and get it on the brake. And we're going to say more about that in a minute. Next is the straight line deceleration, which is where most of the braking takes place. And then trail braking in most, but not all corners. And I'm assuming everyone here knows that trail braking means braking while cornering, but that is all it means. It's nothing more than that. And then last, but not least in this case, the transition off the brakes and onto the gas. And we're going to say a lot more about that as we go through. Now, a couple of the quotes here I want to mention, because I want you to think about these if you haven't already, because they help us prioritize how to think or where to put our attention during a brake zone. Ross Bentley says 2/3 of the braking's happening in the first third of the braking zone. In other words, 2/3 of our slowing down in the first third. And whether that's literally true or not, that's the way we want to think about it. And Gunnar Jeanette put a little more detail around that. He said the priorities and focus in the brake zone in the first third is to slow down. We're using the brakes heavily. We're slowing the car down. The second third is to get the downshift done. And you could include in that second third, being prepared to turn in. And the last third is about the brake release. Now, again, that isn't necessarily literally true, but that's how we want to think about the priorities. Because as we're going to see, it's very important to get as much braking done as early as possible so that we can optimize, getting off of the brakes. So let's use some examples here and take some of this another step down. So here's a heavy braking example, turn 1 at Watkins Glen, and in this set of photos that follow here, I begin braking at 400, but do I really? And we'll say more about that. If you look at the graph, the moment when we decide we're going to brake, our foot's still hopefully on the gas pedal on the floor, and we have to lift it off and get it on the brake. And so we really want to ignore a point called beginning of braking and think about an accelerate to point. Thanks to Peter Krause for that term. But the point here is we want to accelerate all the way, foot on the floor, up until the point where we are going to move our foot onto the brake pedal. And that's tip number one, that we want to think about accelerate to point, not beginning a brake. However, many times they aren't the same. Many of us coast between, in other words, we take our foot off the gas and lollygag some before we get our foot on the brake pedal. And the only way to know for sure is to, look at a speed graph or a longitudinal G graph. And here's an example of a speed graph, from Watkins Glen, same corner. And if we zoom in a little bit, we see that the very beginning of the brake zone here, we didn't really slow down as fast as we should have. The slope of this line here at the beginning is not as steep as this one. So what's going on? Well, in this day and age, many of us have data we can look. So here, again, same corner, same brake pressure graph that was there earlier, but now we have the throttle trace, and we can see that that same not so steep slope is on the gas. In other words, in this case, I spent 55 feet going from 100% throttle to 90% throttle. Now, that's, more than 50 feet where, I should have been doing something else. So that's the bad news. The good news is, in this case, if we look at how long it took me to go from 90% to 0%, that's this, vertical line here. That happened in 40 feet. That's more like it. And the time it took me to go from, get from the brake pedal, from 0% on the gas pedal to at least some pressure on the brake pedal was 35 feet. So that's respectable. So there, I didn't lollygag, wave my foot in between the gas pedal and the brake pedal. I got on the brake pedal and got with it. But I messed around with the throttle, for 50 feet that I didn't need to do. And I mentioned this as a first tip to look at because this is low-hanging fruit for anyone. If we're coasting, not getting our foot off the gas pedal immediately and onto the brake pedal, then we can fix that easily. And yes, it's not a huge amount of time, but again, it's low-hanging fruit. And especially if you're doing that in more than one corner on a track, then you're going to pick up some time. So let's just look at the rest of the brake zone, and then we'll come back and here you can. I'm just making the point that we traveled some distance before we really get on the brakes. I said it was 35 feet to get to essentially any brake pressure, but by the time we're on full brake pressure, we're almost 100 feet into the brake zone, right? So there are these natural delays that are just part of what we have to understand about how the braking process works. And of course, as we start to approach turn in, we have to begin to reduce the brake pressure so that by the time we get to turn in, the brake pressure is relaxing and not, because obviously if it were still in heavy brakes at this point, the car isn't going to turn, or if it does turn, it's not going to be happy. So we have to get this right. And then of course are in the braking point someplace before the apex. So that's just dissecting that corner. A couple of reminders, and then the next tip. You've seen me use this slide before where I talk about thinking about brake pressure on a 0 to 10 scale, 0 no brakes, 10 full on ABS, and so on. Maximum stopping is it like 9.5 or 9.8, whatever you want to think of. So if we're braking for turn 1 at Watkins Glen, we want to use a 9 on a 10 scale in the initial braking, and we want to be turning in by the time we're at 2.5 or something. On a fast corner, obviously, we're not going to brake at a 9. We're going to brake at a 2 or a 3, and we're going to turn in on almost no brake, very little trail brake. So you've seen me use this before. I put this in here because tip number 2 is somewhat related. I'm summarizing this by saying modern Porsches require a strong leg. And this is something I've been learning as I've been trying to learn to drive the GT4, that on the modern cars, we obviously want to squeeze the brakes. We don't want to jump on the brake pedal or the car gets upset, obviously. But we really do have to press pretty hard. So we have to, train our foot to get on the brakes and then really get on the brakes. That's why I put 1, 2 here to emphasize that the 1 is getting on the brakes and 2 is to get us, with that strong leg kicking in. And here's an example with a graph, a brake pressure graph, same corner, and now the graph that you saw earlier is the lower one here, which was early in an event where I really was working on this. And you can see, if you look carefully at the graph, that that I was able to brake later by a fair bit, actually, and get off the brakes at more or less the same point. But to do that, I had to, use a lot more brake pressure. The car measured 1100 psi instead of 850. That's a significant difference, obviously. And and if anything, I overslowed in this example. So the lower curve here actually, the higher curve here actually ended up slightly slower at this point. So this was plenty of brake, even braking later. Basically the same end of braking point, but an earlier accelerate 2 point. And this is something I'm not sure everyone appreciates, which is why I put it here as tip 2. Again, this is low-hanging fruit. Not that it's necessarily the easiest thing to do if you're not used to really standing on the brake pedal. I came from a car where if I'd have done this, it would have really upset the car. My 968 would not have tolerated this, but the GT4 has huge brakes and they really need to be, stood on to work. And I'm sure the same is true on many other cars. So that's tip 2. Tip 3 is how much trail brake, to actually think about that, to be aware of in any given corner, how much pressure are you using for how long, and to actually think about that and decide what works, and actually experiment with, how far into the corner am I going to trail? Am I going to go almost to the apex? Am I going to go halfway to the apex? That sort of thing. Now here's some general rules. Long corners and slow corners need more trail brakes. So the example in the diagram here from Ross Bentley, that's a fairly sharp, longer corner, so a fair amount of trail brake. If that were a 60-degree corner, then we would do very little or even no trail braking. Think about turn 10 at Watkins Glen, very little trail brake. Think about turn 10 at VIR, South Bend. Really don't want to trail brake there. Of course, camber and elevation make a big difference. And cars, in particular, front and rear engine cars, need more trail brake than mid-engine cars do, because mid-engine cars naturally, will turn more readily. Some common mistakes that I've seen over the over the years. Generally too much trail brake. In other words, too much brake pressure at the turn in and after it, carrying too much brake into the corner, and then maybe even trailing in too far so that the car is still, upset from the braking or not back stable so that you can get on the gas. And one way to kind of calibrate your head is this isn't, again, quite literally true, but it makes a point. And this is Randy Pope's quote. He said, the main reason we trail brake is to keep our right foot away from the gas pedal. And he's correct. We don't want to get to the gas until we're ready to get to the gas. And so the point is, we may be trailing with very little, brake effort. The car is going to be slowing anyway. This part of the corner in the red here, especially this lighter red, is where the car is doing its maximum cornering. It's going to be slowing by itself. So we don't have to use the brakes to slow the car. In fact, we want to use the brakes for something else that we're going to talk about in a minute. But the car is going to be slowing anyway. But it's too soon in this example to get on the gas back here or here. We have to be patient. And by thinking about trailing, keeping our foot away from the gas is one way to, tell ourselves that, we only want so much brake as we get into the corner, especially as we get further into the corner. So just, thinking about how much trail brake, here's a couple of quick examples. Watkins Glen, there's really no slow corners, although there are some long ones. There certainly are some high-speed braking zones, heavy brake zones, like the turn 1 example we've already looked at. The bus stop is similar. Turn 8 is almost, it's not as much, but it's still a pretty heavy brake zone. We certainly want to trail at Watkins Glen into many corners. Turn 6 is an obvious example. Turn 8, turn 9, the bus stop. But the elevation does affect that a lot, right? Turn 6, downhill, we trail a long ways. Turn 7, yes, we trail a bit, but not very much because we're going uphill and we don't need the brakes to help the car turn after the initial turn in. Then, of course, we have turns 10 and 11 that are fast and require very little trailing. Now, if we think about lightning, we have heavy brake zones at turn 1 and turn 7. We can trail into turn 1. We certainly can trail into turn 2 and 5 and the light bulb. And elevation in this case helps our braking in all of those in turn 1 and the light bulb, and even to some extent in 5. So we don't have any really unfavorable elevation like we did at Watkins Glen. Turn 7 is a bit of an unusual situation, because normally you would think a long, slower corner like that would want a lot of trail brake. But in fact, we don't want a trail brake. We want to do the braking in a straight line because of the way the camber is on that corner. There's favorable camber with an early apex. But if we do what you would think would be a normal apex on that corner, we end up with unfavorable camber. So the camber trumps the trail braking in the example of turn 7. Common mistake that people trail into that corner and give up a good bit of time doing so. So tip number 4, focus on end of braking. You've probably heard this before, that it's much more important than where we begin braking, and it's better to brake a few feet earlier and modulate at the end than it is to try to brake at the last possible moment. What that means is, as you're trying to get better, if you aren't using your end of braking as a reference point, meaning if you don't know what your end of braking point is, and if it's not consistent lap after lap, then that's something to work on. And here's some steps or suggested ways you can think about doing it, going to work on it. First step is just be aware of how much brake pressure you have at turn in, and obviously be aware of the end of braking point. But but we have to have a consistent approach to the corner, and an easy way to measure that is how much brake pressure do I have it turn in? Is it a 2 out of a 10 scale, or a 4 or a 1? And then secondly, become aware of exactly how you're modulating the brake pedal. And here we're talking about increasing the sensitivity in that right foot, to get a feel for that last little bit of how we come off the brakes. And the third step then is to experiment with an earlier or later EOB and see what that does. Try a late one close to the apex, try one, only slightly after turn in, and so on, and see what difference that makes. And tip 5, can be thought of as somewhat related to EOB, but I put them in that sequence on purpose, because if you don't have an end of braking point in mind and some consistency around it, then working on timing and rate of release isn't going to be as effective as it should be. Now, I suppose it'd be possible to work on EOB and this at the same time, but in any case, I suggest you do it in the sequence here. So here, Ross Bentley hammers on this point that the difference between good drivers and the best drivers is the timing and rate of release of the brakes. And the only way you're going to find what works for you is to experiment. You could experiment by releasing the brakes early but slowly, late but quickly, at turn in and slowly, at turn in and fast, and so on. If you experiment, obviously the car is going to react in different ways, and getting used to what that means and what the car does is what I'm suggesting here. And the way to do it is to pick 1 or 2 corners and spend a session just experimenting, and then come in and write down what you observe. And do they make sense to you? Do you understand why the car, if you release the brakes quickly, maybe the car, moved in a way that you liked, or maybe it moved in a way you didn't like. Write that down, try to understand that. But timing and rate of release of the brakes is where the magic happens. And I wish there were a silver bullet way to describe how to master this technique. But in fact, this is what pros practice and work on. And so for us, poor amateurs, we're a long ways, in front, a long ways from that learning curve. So we need to kind of start up that learning curve if we haven't. And last and least in the sequence here, because you can't work on this without being aware of and sensitive to the previous items, is car rotation. Now, first of all, I have to point out that car rotation applies to slower corners, some medium speed corners. Rotation is not something we want in a high speed corner. If we're going into turn 10 at Watkins Glen, last thing we want is the back end stepping out, or turn 10 at VIR. We want the car nice and planted in a high speed corner. But in a slower corner, or a medium speed corner, think turn 8, the heel at Watkins Glen, as an example that comes to mind. We wouldn't mind if the car rotated some and meant that we had to put in less steering input. Now, the question, of course, is what causes rotation and how can we do it? Well, the magic in rotation is just enough entry speed into a corner, enough trail brake, and enough steering input. If we overdo it, the car will oversteer or even spin if we really overdo it. If we do too little, the car will go through the corner just fine, like it's on rails, but we're having to do all of the turning in that example with the steering wheel, not with the car rotating. So how do we rotate the car? Well, this is what I've deduced. We need enough entry speed. Again, if we're not into the corner fast enough, the next steps aren't going to do anything. But if we have enough entry speed, then if we do a quick and relatively crisp steering input, I don't mean a jerk, but I mean a decisive turn of the steering wheel, that should cause the back end to should cause the front to want to understeer a little bit, which the converse of which is the back to step out just slightly. And then we can manage how much of that happens with how we come off the brakes. And it's pretty easy to describe here. And it feels really good when you get it right. But this is not something for everyone. This is an advanced technique for those of you who are going at a good clip and who want to try it. But I do not necessarily recommend that. Well, in fact, let me say it differently. This is not a technique for everyone. If you're happy, driving it at 8 tenths or 8.5 tenths, you may not need to rotate the car. But at the same time, we're talking advanced braking tips here, and this is obviously an important advanced part of using the brakes. So that's the story. 6 advanced braking tips. I have to remind everyone the priorities are always the line and finding the earliest we can get our foot down first. But once we have that, then we can refine our braking using the suggestions here. Focus on an accelerate 2 point, not a beginning of braking. And make sure that you're not coasting or lollygagging in between. Use a strong leg if you have a modern car. Think about and be aware of and experiment with how much trail braking you're doing. And focus on that end of braking point and get that consistent. Work on the timing and rate of release of the brakes. And if you actually do enough of that, you will find the car rotating, because actually that's a big part of it. So those last 2, if you do enough of 5, 6 will kind of take care of itself, I think. But in any case, think of these in the sequence that I've got them here as a way to improve your braking on track and make it more consistent. So with that said, if you do have any questions, feel free to email me at the gilbertford@rcn.com email address. And certainly you can see me at the track. Happy to answer questions or talk about any of these topics or any other driving topic or that you have a question about. With that said, I look forward to seeing you at the track, and everyone enjoy your next event. And I look forward to seeing you soon.